Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, exploring the cultures of consciousness. Unplugging, revealing, peeling back the layers of rock and roll and finding occult forces is a time-honored game in American culture, going back to the 1950s when the popularity of the music of Elvis Presley and the hips of Elvis Presley got lots of groups all stirred up about the devil's music that was in rock and roll, which is, of course, also a way of saying that when white people play black people music, that something nefarious may be afoot. And from that point onward, from both musicians and critics and fans and pagans, the history of rock and roll has been bound up with various ideas, practices, images, and experiences associated with the occult and the esoteric. We've, on this very show, we've spoken with Chris Knowles a number of years ago, the author of A Secret History of Rock and Roll, and he plunged into the connections between the ancient Eleusinian mysteries and the rituals and rites of punk and rock and roll. And then, of course, yours truly must admit to have written a book on the occult in Led Zeppelin. And that's was a wonderful book in my writing career. It was probably the most fun I ever had writing anything because I just became completely obsessed about it. And my goal when I wrote this book was to kind of fuse two parts of my being. And one part was the adult cultural critic who was able to analyze cultural objects and understand them in terms of larger social forces and technological changes and cultural zeitgeist situations. And then the other part was a completely obsessed, horny, pot-smoking 14-year-old who was totally into Led Zeppelin. And the whole idea was to fuse these two creatures and to kind of not only talk or analyze about the occult dimensions of Led Zeppelin, which of course is connected with the rumors of devil worship, pacts with the devil, with the notorious Aleister Crowley and the mysterious hand signs Jimmy Page would make on stage and, all that kind of stuff. But the idea was not just to analyze that but to almost try to express what it is like to read rock music, to listen to rock music with esoteric desires uncorked in one's soul, which produced a lot of very amusing responses. I think it's almost a kind of triumph that my reviews on Amazon for that book have all stars are represented. It's almost an even spread between the 5 stars and the 1 stars. Everyone weighing in at every level, which I think is actually kind of a triumph. And some of my favorite reviews are actually the ones that are most critical, and they usually describe me as going far over the. Just way too over the top in reading these occult elements in, what is also just a kind of trivial and goofy rock and roll record. But that's kind of the point. The point is that there's always this tension in the rock and roll occult between, is it serious or is it a goof? Is it the projection of, naive fans, or is it the instrumental, insidious insertion of secret messages and arcane images? And just the nature of rock and roll makes that resolution impossible to achieve. And that's part of the fun, and it's part of the fun of Peter Bebergal's new book, Season of the Witch, which is probably the most thorough account of the occult and rock and roll that we have. We've had Peter on the show before as well to talk about his esoteric childhood, and I was very happy to see the way that he placed his own narrative in the context of being a obsessive, teenager and finding all of these extra messages and hidden implications in the commodities of the culture industry, particularly at that very weird period in the early 1970s, which, as regular listeners will know, is one of my current obsessions. And Peter was the one who really enlightened me on a very important fact about that period, which was also the period when I was an adolescent or pre-adolescent going into an adolescent, but really when I first mapped my sense of the larger cultural world or the larger political world was in the late 70s. And Peter pointed out something really very profound, which is that's the really kind of one of the only times in modern American cultural history where a lot of the producers of the material that people like me were reading in magazines and comic books and listening to records and things like that was done by people who were heads, who were either taking drugs or they had taken drugs and they were interested in the occult or they were interested in mysticism or, all of that weird countercultural spirituality was not just in the air, but it was actually in the artifacts, the cultural artifacts that people like me were consuming, so that my model of like what a great and powerful cultural artifact is partly shaped by the residue of this whole head generation, and it really helped me see part of the mysterious logic of that era. But Peter's book goes back much farther, earlier to origins of rock and roll and African American music, and he takes it into the more contemporary mode, although not as much as perhaps some would like. But we'll get to that in just a second. First, we'll bring on our co-host here on Expanding Mind, Maja Daou. Hey, Maja.
Hi, Erik.
Well, we've talked a lot about rock and roll and the occult, and you've talked about rock and roll and the occult as well. What do you go back to as sort of like the most important icon or band or record or image in the whole rich stream of mystical rock and roll?
We love rock and roll and the occult, okay? Like, we just love it. So, sorry, Expanding Mind peeps. We talk about it.
We're going to do it again.
Because we love it. So, first of all, I would just say I, like you, experience deep, meaningful synchronicities with the symbolism. And, yeah, you can get real, like, conspiracy theory, paranoid, schizo with tracing all the things, but I have to say, like, my deep interest in unlocking these symbols and stuff like that, like you so eloquently describe in your Led Zeppelin book, is that those were real, like, when they happened. I would have stuff unlock around certain songs or bands. It would open these magical experiences that were just crazy. And so that's what, like, pulled me in. Like, that's the thing, like, it's not even like we're interested in the occult and music. It's that we've experienced occult expression through music, and that's what keeps me all in it. It's because music for me is one of the key, like, kind of unlockers to synchronistic events since I was, like you, like a dumb 14-year-old smoking cigarettes listening to Led Zeppelin. So it's a big part of my whole spiritual life is occult and rock and roll. So having said that, I love these kind of topics, and I've spent so much time reading about, African-American history and slavery and occultism and voodoo and how all of that stuff ties in, and then the in-between between Europe and, especially Britain and Jamaica and all that stuff. So if I was to try to really pin it down to one, like, real mystical thing that is, for me, that, it's a little tricky because I had, like, so many experiences deeply with so many albums, like you said, all the Led Zeppelin, all the psychedelic stuff. Jimi Hendrix would just unlock all kinds of stuff. I got super into The Cure at that age, and, like, I'd have all this crazy stuff with the Cure songs that's really, you can judge whatever you want on that. And then also similarly heavy metal too. So it wasn't even like restricted to the, say, rock and roll genre, but it more took on this quality of spirit or hidden things acting through music, or spirit acting through music, I guess I should say.
Yeah, that's the thing is it starts to spread. You're in a drum circle, and the drums are suddenly take on some kind of character, or it goes beyond the rock language, but there's something particularly about rock in terms of its Dionysian kind of intensity and its sort of loudness and its relationship to bombast and to excess and intensity that makes it a particularly right place to check it out. Well, with all that said, let's bring Peter onto the show. Peter, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Hello.
Hey there.
Hey.
How's it going, man?
Good. How you doing, Erik?
I'm doing good. Congratulations on the book. It's always nice to have your book finally hit the mass mind.
Yes, thank you.
That's great. So one of the things we were just talking about is just how much stuff there is. Once you start looking for these connections, the connections between, and not leaving aside religion, just looking at mysticism, at the occult, at the esoteric, and looking at the history of popular music in the last 75 years or so. There's so much, and you covered a lot, and I'm kind of curious, like how you sort of decided what you wanted to focus on or how you wanted to organize your story. What were the big themes that you wanted to bring forward that would help people make a connection between all of these different bands, some of them very well known, Pink Floyd, David Bowie, Black Sabbath, and some of them less well known, Arthur Brown, Coil, these other Coven and these sort of more obscure groups. It's a lot of material. How did you come to sort of tell the bigger story?
Well, thanks for asking that question, because I think one of the important things was that I didn't want to turn this into an encyclopedia, because it would have been very easy. Well, it wouldn't have been. It would have been impossible to list every instance of where these things show up. And so I realized when I was working even at the proposal level, I knew what I wanted the book to be about. And a good friend of mine, Ethan Gilsdorf, who's also a writer, he said to me, what's the story? You have to find the story. It's not enough that you have this abstract idea that we all agree something's happened, that in some way the occult and alternative spirituality have had something to do with the shaping and the history of rock and roll. But you need to find the narratives. So I realized what I needed to do then really was find those particular stories that I felt really contained all of those elements that I wanted to look at, those bigger themes. And so I started really with having to define – I knew that even trying to define the occult was going to be very difficult. So I wanted to define something that I thought could contain all of it. And so I use in the book often this term, the occult imagination, because I really feel that when we're talking about the occult, it's very easy to fall into the trap of talking about particular kinds of practices or particular kinds of beliefs. But the occult imagination is a broader landscape that allows us to also talk about people who don't believe in the occult think about the occult. What do people who are against the occult or ideas about the occult think about it? What do music marketing people think about it? What is this whole container, not just the practice or the beliefs, but the whole way in which the culture is shaped and responds to these ideas, these images, these symbols. And
I think that's a wonderful distinction. It's something I've also wrestled with in some of my own work, where there is this tendency to just focus on is there a real belief here? Is the devil here? Is there something? Are they actually doing something? When that very question, that wonder, that sense of either something profane or terrible happening or something really exciting happening, that's already part of the story. That's already part of the imagination, and that's partly why it's so effective for particularly young people. When you're an adolescent and your imagination is like raging. I mean, I just remember like the ability of images or ideas or songs to transport me or to obsess me because your mind is changing. You got all these hormones flowing. The dream life is opening up. I mean, it's a very powerful time for the imagination, this thing within us that makes dreams, that makes fantasies, that makes daydreams, that can ride and unpack symbols. And so that's part of the occult imagination as well. Hello?
Oh, did we lose him?
I think we might have lost him.
Uh-oh.
So Mr. PRN has to call up Peter again. So hopefully we'll be talking to him in just a moment.
I think, Erik, what you just said is, I mean, it's so accurate, and making those distinctions, a lot of people only look at it in this certain paradigm, but we have to look at, like you said, like the judges of it as well, like in order to kind of get a better handle on it, because you can be one thing, but then if you're perceived as another thing, then the whole thing that you are gets totally lost, which I think is true of all the occult connections to rock and roll, is people have put other stuff on it, but then you have to be like, well, what exactly is it before everybody starts talking about it? You can kind of get back to the thing that it actually is, right? So that's where all the research and track back that Peter did comes in handy, because you can look at not just what it's kind of turned into with the hype, you know?
Absolutely. Are we still? Do we have you, Peter? Well, we're going to keep on striving to discover him, and that, just to think on the way that this issue came up with the Led Zeppelin book, is that part of what I was trying to do was actually stir up my own excessive imagination and bring that into the story, which is why some people really didn't read it right. They're like, "Why, he's going way too far." It's like, there's no real connection here. It's just a bunch of bullshit. And the whole point was to express the way in which, once your mind becomes enchanted, or your emotions become enchanted with a cultural object, that's part of what the magic of the thing is that you do take it too far. It does become part of your life, your own experience of synchronicity, your own sense
fanatic.
of the meaningful
it's
things.
The energy of fanatic, right? You go crazy. You're like the girls watching Elvis shake his hips. There's something that in you just goes cuckoo. It's that ability for rock and roll to take that like frenzy type of thing where it turns you on so hard that your imagination goes cuckoo and it's over the top.
Exactly. Well, I think we got Peter back on. Sorry about that snafu there. We got you? Hello?
Yes.
Oh, there we go.
Hello.
Yes, good. We got you again. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I was teleported into some etheric zone, and now I'm back.
Well, hopefully you come back with more wisdom. So we were talking about the bigger stories and about the importance of making a distinction between the occult as a set of practices and beliefs and a broader sense, which is much more applicable to talking about culture, of the occult imagination and how that creates a bigger framework to understand what's going on with rock and roll.
That's right. And I think in some ways whether or not these things exist or whether they're real at a metaphysical level is sort of irrelevant to the story that I wanted to tell. That's a different question. Those are interesting questions. They're not the questions here. The problem is when you shout out to the world that you're going to be doing something on the occult, that's often the first conversation that they want to have. And so I felt that by focusing on narrative, focusing on the stories, the way in which these things were actually expressed and activated in the popular culture, and then how the culture responded to that, doesn't leave a lot of room for questions of whether or not these things are real in a phenomenal sense, right? I was trying to get at something else, and so what's interesting, though, is to see that it's very difficult for people to parse those things. But I think that when you're looking at stories, you get to focus in on the narrative and what actually happened. And within that story certainly are what people believed or what they didn't believe. But contextualized within the context of narrative allowed me, in many ways, some structure. that I don't think I would have had otherwise had I just wanted to list every band or mention every way in which, there had been negative responses, or even to ask questions about whether or not there really is a real force behind this. However, I want to qualify that to say that I do believe, and this is probably something that I obviously can't prove through narrative, but I do believe that there is a deep unconscious drive towards a kind of ecstatic experience, towards a kind of impulse to interact directly with the divine, or whatever you want to call it, that often is a play that is both joyful and dangerous, that can leave you both illuminated and burned. And we can see this in the history of magic, which really in many ways at the outset is the beginning of the history and the story of religion. And that impulse, even with the rise of science and reason, which are valuable, obviously, that impulse never left us. And though it may have been buried at certain times in history, it's never left us. And that rock and roll provided this amazingly potent vehicle for that impulse to be reignited and to be expressed again. Is it really driven by the gods, the old gods? I don't know. But I do know that it's driven by the ways in which those gods were once worshipped. And so I tell in the introduction, I end the introduction with the story of Dionysus, because I feel like in many ways he is the patron saint of this book, that he represents, at least in terms of his both the myth of Dionysus, the psychology, if we want to play it at a Jungian level, the way in which his symbols and the ideas of that god and the way in which he was worshipped are ever present, I think, in the story of rock and roll. And so as much as I'm not going to say anything metaphysical, I do believe that there is a drive, a very human drive, to have that ecstatic, direct encounter with the noumenal that is in many ways the spirit that energizes the story of rock and roll.
Yeah, and you don't even have to get into the metaphysics, because especially since so much of this has to do with trance, with rhythm, with collective effervescence, that there are, very robust psychobiological ways to talk about this drive and whether it appears in, a medieval festival, in an ancient theatrical event, and in a contemporary rave. There are clearly ways in which our bodies and minds are wired for trance and for certain kinds of ecstatic experiences. What I really like, though, is that way you talk about those moments of transport as a combination of kind of joy and threat, of potential burnout and potential illumination. That it's that sort of mixture of the sacred and the profane, or the light and the dark, that really is a kind of a marker of these spaces. And it just brings back an experience I had when I was young that really changed my life. I was 10 years old, and I was living in a foreign country with my family, and there wasn't a lot of stuff in English language. I'd go to the English language bookstore and buy science fiction books, and was reading The Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. And one afternoon I was watching one of the rare TV shows that was in English, and it was a BBC documentary on the history of rock and roll. And I will never forget, and I've seen the clip since, and it's a very powerful one, but the effect of watching Erik Burden and the Animals do their version of House of the Rising Sun. I think it's like 1965. And it's not even that crazy. I mean, they're still wearing suits. Their hair's not that long. But there's this look in Erik Burden's eyes. He's staring at this camera. It's this smoldering animation of threat and pleasure, and it just rocked my world, and it was a transmission. It's like I changed at that moment through that television set, through that rock and roll recording, into someone who was really interested in discovering what is behind, or what connects those experiences of dark and light through the transmission of music and all that music can do for you. So I think it's a really great way to remind everyone that the specifics about the occult and the gods and beliefs and practices, that's all very interesting, but it's directly connected to things that everybody can appreciate, that everybody understands about music and its evocative power, its transformative power, its deeply pleasurable power. It's something that's our, whatever the supernatural story, it's part of our natural birthright.
That's right, and we're ready to give over to it. I talk about this a little bit in the book, but I'd like to expand on it. And I've said it in other places, which is, I believe it's the same transmission that happens when we go to see a stage magician. That we know at every level that there's a trick, as it were, and that maybe even if we were taught it, with enough practice we could learn how to do it, and yet. The moment that we sit down in our seats and the lights come on, we are ready to be hypnotized. We are ready to suspend that disbelief. We want to be part of that transmission. Something happens there that allows us to be transported, even though we might know at some rational level, or maybe in our whole being, that it's not real. The power of that relationship between the magician and the audience is extremely powerful. And I think it's in many ways the same relationship that the shaman has with the tribe. It's maybe even if we look at, later development in magical orders, it's the same relationship that the master of the lodge has with the initiates, right? That we know it's in many ways play. We get that it's play. But there's a part of us that wants to be transported by that play. And I think the spirit of play is actually very important, too, because without that spirit of play, without the ability once in a while to step back and to see ultimately how fun this all really is, right? I think we would lose something also.
Let me ask you this, especially pertaining to the threat, because... right? It does. I mean, everything you're saying is pretty accurate throughout history. It's undeniable. People do this stuff, whether you want to judge it good or bad or whatever. But why is there resistance to that playful energy to confront and feel these pleasures? What do you think the threat is in that play, in that, our desire to seek those states, and how some individual human beings or organizations of human beings absolutely oppose and are threatened by that type of behavior? And why is it regulatory kind of groups of people that try to restrict that very human, very biological, very ancient kind of thing? I mean, in your research, were you able to hone that down a little? I know that's an impossible question that can then go all sorts of conspiracy directions, but
right.
Did you have
I
any...
think it's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it has to. Well, I think I said it's a fear of chaos. It's a fear of not having control. It's why in the story of Dionysus, Pentheus does not want the Maenads dancing in the hills outside of Thebes. But at the same time, he's completely seduced by the idea to go and watch them, which ultimately destroys him because he's not initiated, right? He wants it's the same reason why we're titillated. It's the same ways in which we're titillated by the things that we keep saying are bad, right? So, when you think about even the nipple slip controversy, right? But, next, just flip the channel that same night, and it was what you were seeing was probably more explicit.
Oh,
right?
and then everyone would go and look at it, too.
Well, exactly. So I think it's about control. And I also think that when you're dealing with these kinds of activities, whether it's, dancing for the gods, or divining, or trying to speak to spirits, or whatever is helping people feel, whether in history or even now, have that connection, that it's an unmediated experience often. And the hierarchies don't like they feel that their job is to mediate everything.
Right.
The idea of the unmediated spiritual experience is at the heart of this, and I think that that's why, at its core, the rebellion of rock, even though it's often expressed itself politically, socially, sexually, and all those are absolutely essential to its history, that at its core it's a spiritual rebellion, because it's rebelling against very ideas of how we interact with the world from our very being. And early on that was really characterized by its sexuality. But even the sexuality of early rock was a middle finger to the religious authorities that said sex is sin, sex is of the devil, sex is, so even it's the swaying of the hips, that urge, even though it looks at the surface as merely sexual rebellion, I think even at the base of that is spiritual rebellion.
Well, spiritual rebellion is a great topic to jump off on. We got to take a break here. You're listening to Expanding Mind with Erik Davis and Majid Daou. We're talking with Peter Bebergal on his new book, The Season of the Witch, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Expanding Minds on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm Majid Daou here with Erik Davis. We're talking with Peter Bebergal today about rock and roll and everyone's favorite, the occult. So let's talk about that spiritual rebellion thing, because Erik and I just did a show where we got to talk all about Satanism, and one of the things that came up on there was the discussion of how Satanism and Luciferianism does have this kind of rebellious nature to it at its most inherent points. And so, I mean, what do you feel like? Did you find connections between those like kind of satanic or Luciferian types of philosophies and those kind of hedonistic pursuits? Like, how would you differentiate? Because this is what the churches and all the like regulators say, right? Is that it's satanic to rebel because then the order is displaced and then you get chaos, right? So do you think that's just like they're making it satanic because they're afraid of it and that's not really Satan? Or is that kind of like how you would describe Satanism? Or like, what's the difference between those two?
Well, I think it's definitely part. I think, rock was always called satanic even before anybody had cracked open, a book of occultism, right?
Right.
those youth, was always called that. Although, and so and what's very interesting is I don't think you really see the more deliberate associations with something satanic or Luciferian until the late 60s and early 70s. And I think in many ways that's a response to the incoming darkness historically that was a result of what some I think some people believe is sort of the failure of the 1960s spiritual liberation promise. It right. didn't happen. The war didn't end. There was still so much poverty. There was still so much sexism and racism, and a lot of historians and critics will tie it into a few moments. The stabbing at the Stones concert at Altamont, or the Manson murders. How is it that the use of LSD, which was supposed to result in this beautiful utopian spiritual dream, end up with a bunch of dirty hippies dropping acid and killing people, right? I mean, that was sort of the way in which people understood that. But you could see it early on. I mean, Joan Didion's wonderful, wonderful story called Slouching Towards Bethlehem. She's in the Haight, and even I think as early as 1967, she was starting to see the winds of despair and drug addiction, poverty amongst these kids, that it wasn't this utopian dream. And so, but the energy, the spiritual energy was still very positive. It was an outlook towards the future, and in many ways towards the east, right, away from the west, towards where there seemed to be this hopeful idea of illumination. But by the 70s, something darker, I think, had taken hold of the occult imagination. And so you start to see a little bit more explicit elements of this starting to come through. Sabbath sound, obviously, even Led Zeppelin. I mean, their sound is, when you compare it to something only a few years earlier, and there's a kind of darkness to it, and you can even hear that in some of the later Beatles stuff, of course. So we can see it's happening.
Yeah, it's almost like this. You can track through rock and roll the gradual release of subconscious darkness.
I absolutely think so. I think so, absolutely. And then you have them start playing with this. You have Sympathy for the Devil, and you have, Jagger really, I think, imagining himself as this, I recently called him, this sort of Baudelarian dandy, kind of a Luciferian figure that, was it Satan, the Antichrist? No. I don't think so. I think it was the symbols of rebellion, though, that are inherent in those mythologies that people glommed onto. And plus, what better way to throw up a middle finger to culture, to say to your audience and to your audience's parents and to the church that you're dangerous than by evoking these images and these ideas.
Right.
You don't even need to believe in them to recognize how powerful they are. And that gets back to this idea of how these symbols, whether they represent something real or not, is irrelevant to how quickly they activate some part of our unconscious that responds immediately to them, either positively or negatively.
So what do you think's happening as we get used to those images? I mean, that's another way of describing this, is that, these powerful ideas and stances become part of, popular iconography, and then after a while it's a shtick, it's a cliche. I mean, this is in a way the long, wonderful story of heavy metal is one in which a gesture is made that has some sense of authenticity, and then it's immediately sort of turned into a kind of shtick. And so there's this weird vacillation between just having a goof, a dark goof, but a goof nonetheless, and then the sense that something real is happening. And that I think is really part of the story. I mean, one period of metal that you don't talk about as much as I wish you had in your book, because I think it's a very fascinating one, is you mentioned, you do address it, but for me it's one of the more important parts of the story in the 1990s, in the early 90s, with the rise of black metal. It's always struck me that black metal hit the kind of broader music world at about the same time that gangster rap did. And what those things shared is this sense that the people you're listening to are the real deal. That even if you don't believe, whatever, like, Ice-T's, he's real, and
right.
That there's something, and that's part of the performance then. So there's this weird flickering between performing and some kind of authenticity that seems to be part of the rock and roll logic of the occult.
Well, first, let me say that you're absolutely right, and I think in many ways it was deliberate to leave that out, mainly because I felt that all I was going to be doing was having to fly in the shadow of the book Lords of Chaos and other books that I think have really done a great job with unpacking that whole thing. So I felt overwhelmed, by that. There's a whole other book in there, right? In many ways, there was a whole other book in everything I touched on. So, I made those deliberate choices. Sometimes I do think to the detriment of the overall story. But hopefully there's still enough there. But yes, so there is that kind of thing, but that's where we get to sort of I think that getting burned. Because I think you can only take that element of maybe this kind of will to power, using your music as a kind of vehicle for a will to power so far. Look at how much of both of metal and the rap you're talking about ended up in violence, ended up with people just damaged by that. And so there's a sense that this stuff maybe is, whether it's real or not, the way it works in us, in our subconscious, and how it gets manifested in our lives can be a tricky thing.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, because that is a big part of the rock and roll occult thing, too, is like, even if it's maybe not their intention to make people go kill themselves, there are a good percentage of people that react to rock and roll music in that violent manner. So then it's like you get into all the PMRC stuff, right? Like, did Marilyn Manson make people commit suicide, right? So then it's like it comes down to that point of influence, and is it really there in the music, or why are people having those kind of reactions to it, where they'll, like, go all crazy and stab people on stages, right? So where does that element come in?
Well, I think maybe it's when you lose that sense of playfulness that, you know, you know, and you see that in the places where it starts to go bad. Even look, you know, Mick Jagger was very excited about all this. So let's talk about him. Let's go back to him. So he's a good example, right? He liked he liked dressing up. He liked people seeing him as this kind of Lucifer principal, right? You know, that was going that had power that could seduce you and your daughters, and you know, and then he meets Kenneth Anger. And Kenneth Anger comes to him basically saying, I want you, you are Lucifer. I want you to personify him in a film. And he meets this fellow who's dead serious about magic, you know, who means it and sees art as a real manifestation of his will in a Crowleyan sense, right? And that maybe he can actually even transform his own career or the Stones' career, who's ever, by virtue of the ability to ritualize this on film, on celluloid. But you know what? It doesn't go well. It doesn't go well for anybody, right? It ends up falling apart for whatever reason. Maybe it's just personalities, you know. But Jagger, after all that, he just goes back to being basically a blues musician, right? You know,
it's like he was confronted with his poserism and he couldn't walk the walk, right?
That's right, and maybe he realized he didn't even want to. When it stopped being fun, you know, when it stopped being an element of, and again, fun doesn't undermine the power of it. The playfulness was, I think, has always been an element, even when we go back and we think about, you know, Dionysus and these gods, and you know, they're gods of libation. They're gods also of joy.
Yeah.
You know, not every Dionysian moment is one where you're completely blasted out of your head, right? It's also one where you're enjoying the fruit of the vine, as it were, and giving a kind of thanks to the God for providing those moments in our lives, right? When we can be transported, when we can be taken out of the mundane for a little while. But if you stop that, if you forget that with that comes a kind of sacrifice, I think that's where you get in trouble.
Yeah, and another element of it is just the fact that it is theater, and when we think about Dionysus, of course, he's a god of theater as well, and that part of the trap gets into when the theater on the stage is taken too seriously, or when they take it too seriously, when we forget that it's also, you know, just a performance. And one of the other kind of traps you point to is paranoia, and I'm particularly thinking here about David Bowie, who, you know, in his mid-70s career and mind, you know, got very into all sorts of spookery that took the form sometimes of quite paranoid responses, and that also seems to be part of the danger, is that you're in playing with the hidden meaningfulness of things. You can go too far, and I'm curious how much you saw that too as a kind of pattern, at least among the people who seem to be swallowed up, at least for a time, by this imaginary.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great, in many ways, it's just a great warning not to mix your Kabbalah with cocaine, right? Like, you know, there needs to be some separations. I think that's why it's often said, at least in the Jewish tradition, you're supposed to be in your 40s and sort of in a settled life before you attempt these things, not still out partying. But we see it with Syd Barrett. We see it with Bowie. I think we see it with the world around Mick Jagger, with the world around the Beatles, even with how out of that culture comes something like Manson. This is in no way to blame them or to say that anything they did had anything to do with it, but just how these things can impact in that way. But they're not responsible. They shouldn't not have done what they did because somebody was going to, read too deeply into it in a murderous way. So absolutely that it can take that turn. And I think a lot of it is, and I think part of what we forget is when we're thinking about these musicians and we see them as timeless. But you know what? At one time, they were just young men and women who suddenly had all kinds of access to money and drugs and ideas. If you were a young Jimmy Page, suddenly you could afford rare volumes of Aleister Crowley and bid on them against Kenneth Anger, But he was in his 20s. He was just a young man who, had all he ever really wanted was to play rock and roll. And suddenly he is in this world of, literati and glamour, and everybody wants to be his friend. Some of the richest people in the world suddenly want to be friends with these once poor, working class kids. And so they arise into this world, I think, not quite prepared. And I think these ideas maybe gave for them a sense of control over their own lives, and also a vehicle for they wanted, I think we always, as much as, the atheist movement is a big part of the world today, I do also think that this drive that I'm talking about is one which is just about trying to connect to something outside of ourselves, trying to connect to a greater meaning. And I think that if you are a young man or a young woman who's seeking a spiritual experience, but you see yourself as rebellious, as pushing up against the mainstream, as on the edge, of course you're going to reach for alternative ways of thinking about spirituality because they fit. They seem to be the right vehicle for a spiritual
it's also
experience.
Seeking freedom, right? To be able to be yourself and not be judged. Like, who wants to be told they're naughty, right? Like, you just want to do what you want to do and feel good. I think that's part of it too.
Right.
I think another factor with the occult thinking that is really true with the rock stars is that it's very easy to slip into a kind of magical thinking when you're riding extraordinary success, and particularly success in a cultural domain where you're rewarded for being a creative personality. Because you imagine, like you're saying, here you are, you're this 20-something kid, and suddenly all the doors are open. Everybody wants to meet you. All the women or boys or whatever are available. You can manifest things you want. You can go places, and it's like, I think it's very easy, particularly because there's an industry around you that wants to have you be be a creative person, to continue to shine with charisma. And so you get this weird kind of relationship that you see it in rock and roll, you see it in Hollywood, where the star is sort of supported by this kind of invisible staff that wants them to continue to be charismatic and to put forward this sense of some kind of amazing life, because that's part of what they're riding on. And I think if you're inside of that, it's probably really difficult to keep your feet on the ground. I mean, really, really difficult. And that's why people get lost. They get lost in drugs. They get lost in paranoia. They get lost in megalomaniacal thinking. I mean, it's not that – it doesn't look that fun. When I read these, I'm like, wow. I mean, it's cool to play your music for a lot of people and not have to have a real job. But there's some real tough sides of that. And I think part of it feeds into this kind of magical thinking about who you are and what you're bringing to people.
That's right, and it's what's interesting about it is how part and parcel that is to the actual creative output. I mean, we're not talking about, a couple of one-hit wonders here. I mean, this is the great music of our age, right? I mean, think about the output of Zeppelin in the early 70s. I mean, this truly is some of the great rock and roll. Think about David Bowie. Think about the brilliance of Station to Station right at the peak of his downfall. It was just his mind was cracked. And this album comes out that its impact on popular music and production and what people thought was possible with pop music is still happening, even though a lot of people that are making music today maybe never even heard it. So you have this really interesting, I think, tension there between all of this. But I do believe, and maybe this is the one. I know this is the one element of the book that I'm going to get pushback on. But I really do believe that if you were to remove this thread we're talking about, this thread of the occult imagination, that this wonderful music that we're talking about would have looked and sounded very different, both in its presentation, in its staging, in its theatrical qualities that we're talking about, maybe even in the way it was produced, that there's an element of the way in which artists have always, and you really see this rise up, I think, in the 1800s, in particular in the late 1800s, that artists who are pushing against the mainstream, who were on the avant-garde, who saw what they were doing as somehow radical, that so many of these artists were also interested in the occult. There's so many of these people that were involved in the Golden Dawn. We see that with Satie and people like that were Rosicrucians. And again, I think it's because that element of artistic rebellion so beautifully ties into an idea for people of spiritual rebellion. And when they're seeking that, they go to these ideas.
No, I think you can say the same thing about modern art and 20th century music as you can about rock and roll, maybe in a different way, a different balance, but that they're inconceivable, particularly modern art, without acknowledging the sort of esoteric stream. And, in a way, that's just one of the sort of increasingly kind of obvious truths about modern cultural history in the West is that, you have science, you have religion, and you have this esoteric stream. And it's one of the ways in which people have organized meanings in a wide variety of different ways. Of course, that's in some ways an overgeneralization, but it's just there. It's part of the atmosphere, and it's certainly part of the story that you tell. But we only have a couple of minutes left here, but I would like to bring it forward a little bit into the sense that in some ways, do you see your story as a story that if it doesn't exactly end, at least it's kind of fading away with the rise of different kinds of genres that have very different relationships to hedonism or ecstasy or psychedelics or these other kinds of factors. Where are these memes? Where are these icons and energies today?
It's really, I think what we still call the underground in terms of music is really doing an amazing job of reviving these ideas, these symbols. You see it, I think, in a really fascinating way with electronic musicians, with musicians who are working with people who are particularly interested in analog equipment, who see, returning to almost some of the stuff that the krautrock musicians were doing, and maybe even reimagining what New Age music can be. We see that in music with bands like Emeralds, some of these smaller, more underground electronic bands that are they're actually looking to New Age music, as the place to start rather than rock and roll. They're turning it into something, I think, that elevates it from, the George Winston type thing. And of course, we see it with all the wonderful things like people like Stephen O'Malley are doing with Sun. We see it with, again, and maybe even in the exaggerated way with bands like Sleep and Ohm. But I think that even for somebody like Emil Amos, who's involved in some of these outfits like Ohm and his own Holy Sons, that he also sees the potential for visionary kinds of experiences, or at least an expression of it. I mean, isn't that an interesting thing where we think about, is music or art the vehicle for the experience, or is it the memory of an experience? Is it a comment on the experience? It's all those things, right? And that's all part of it. It could be it's making fun of it, and that's just as valid. That's why I think it's wonderful when we have bands like, there's a wonderful, great stoner metal, I guess I wouldn't really call them metal, but a stoner band called Uncle Acid and the Deadbeats right now. Wonderful. Their album songs sound like something from an old Misfits album. Great music, totally bringing the whole occult thing up to 11, as it were, but still really great music, and still driven by the spirit of just how exciting and seductive this can be. And again, if we keep that distance and we keep that playful attitude, we're starting to see people embracing it again in a way that's really interesting. Then we also see, the bigger cynical things like Madonna staging her big, Super Bowl thing as almost like an Egyptian initiatory rite.
Right. Well, I think one thing that would be really surprising if we had this conversation 10 years ago, and someone said, hey, in 10 years, the most crazy, paranoid occult fears around popular music is going to be about commercial R&B, with all the Illuminati stuff. And it's just like, you would be like, no, I'm sorry, that's not going to be where it's happening. Forgive me, but that's part of it too. On that huge commercial element, which is a really interesting thing too. It also speaks to the way that even the paranoid, conservative fears have some kind of truth motivating them, because I look at that a lot as just a kind of a feverish meditation on just the nature of mass entertainment and what happens to that level of cash and the kinds of manipulations that go into video, and the pop itself has a kind of satanic, in a not rebellious, not imaginative way that is actually kind of in a weird way represented by these fears, but it's not as nearly as fun as the bands that you're talking about, that recognize the ritualistic element of it, but also make it clear that it is a performance. It always struck me that one of the things about metal shows, when I go to metal shows, is that even the ones that are really scary, that actually seem kind of unnerving and like, what are these guys up to, is they're still, when they stop, they're always like, all right, San Francisco, how you doing?
Exactly.
Like everybody's having a good time. And somehow that makes it really beautiful.
It does, and that's the Dionysian spirit. I think it's not all serious. It's play, it's dance, it's intoxication, not necessarily by substances, but by being in this communal moment with people that suddenly you walk into a room and you say, "Wow, I'm not alone in loving this really weird stuff."
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that note of Dionysian joy, we're going to wrap it up. Peter Bebergal, thanks so much for being with us. And folks out there, enjoy the season of The Witch. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you both for having me.
Thanks.